Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the Tacoma murders. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. On March 26th, during spring break of 1986, 12-year-old Michelle Welch and her two younger sisters rode their bicycles to Puget Park in North Tacoma, Washington at around 10 a.m. in the morning. After a few hours of playing in the park, the girls were getting hungry, and Michelle decided to ride her bike back home to prepare some lunch and bring it back for herself and her sisters. When she returned to the park, her sisters weren't around. Michelle put the brown paper bag with their lunches on a picnic bench, locked her bike up, and went looking for her sisters. Around 1:15 p.m., Michelle's sisters returned and found her bike and the lunches, but there was no sign of Michelle. The two sisters wandered around the park looking for her, calling her name, but got no reply. Worried and scared, the two girls went home, and by 3:10 p.m., the Tacoma police had been called and an official search began. At 11:27 p.m. that evening, the police search and rescue dogs found Michelle's body near a fire pit area in the park. She had been sexually assaulted, suffered blunt force trauma to her head, and her throat had been slit. A classmate of Michelle told investigators that he saw a suspicious-looking man beneath the Proctor Bridge looking at young girls, but the man was never found. In early August of the same year, just 5 months after Michelle went missing, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian was riding her bicycle in Point Defiance Park. The park was just 3 miles from the park where Michelle had disappeared. Jennifer was practicing for a bike ride she had planned in the San Juan Island later that summer. Jennifer took out her new Schwinn 18-speed bike, promised her mother she'd be home by 6:30 p.m., and headed for a road called 5 Mile Drive. When Jennifer hadn't returned by 6:30 p.m. that evening, her mother became worried. 2 hours later, her terrified parents called the police and reported her missing. Police with sniffer dogs searched the park extensively, but there were no signs of Jennifer. 3 teenage boys that went to school with Jennifer recalled seeing her riding her bike at approximately 4:10 p.m. She was riding her bicycle on 5 Mile Drive, as she had told her mother, but they said she didn't seem concerned or in any danger. The police closed the park for 2 days and recruited members of the Green River Killer Task Force to help with the search. But after 2 days of searching, they still found nothing. 3 weeks later, Jennifer's body was found in a remote area of the park by some joggers. Her body had been concealed by brush, and her bicycle was found just a few yards away. Her swimsuit bottoms were pulled down around her ankles, and there was evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. An autopsy showed that Jennifer died of strangulation. With both crimes happening in the same vicinity, both girls being similar in age and appearance, and both riding their bicycles in the parks, police assumed this was the work of the same killer. Thousands of tips were called in of possible suspects seen in the area, and police facial sketches were shown on the nightly news. More than 10,000 hours of police work went into the two investigations, but after all their efforts, no credible leads ever turned up. The killers seemed to have vanished into thin air, and both cases went cold for more than 30 years. Though DNA evidence was found at Michelle's scene, DNA forensic science was in its infancy in 1986. Even CODIS was unavailable at that time. But police saved the DNA samples from each case, knowing that someday technology would change and they would eventually catch the killer. 25 years later, in 2011, the Tacoma Police Department launched a new division concentrated on looking at older cold cases. The cold case of Michelle and Jennifer were part of the reason the new division was created. Detectives poured through dozens of binders of files for the new cases and over 2,300 names connected to the cases. Though there had been no usable DNA collected from Jennifer's crime scene at the time, they had saved the swimsuit bottoms she was wearing. With new technology that wasn't available almost 30 years prior, they were now able to recover male DNA from that swimsuit. It wasn't until 2016 When the two DNA samples from Jennifer and Michelle's murder scenes were compared to each other, the detectives made a startling discovery. For almost 30 years, police believed that Jennifer and Michelle had been killed by the same person, but now they knew there were in fact two different killers. Armed with the new DNA results from Jennifer's crime scene, police had a list of 160 different suspects, but they needed to get DNA samples from them to compare to the semen found on Jennifer's bathing suit. In May 2018, the FBI knocked on the door of 60-year-old Robert Washburn, who had lived near Point Defiance Park at the time, but now lived in Eureka, Illinois. Washburn was on the list of the 160 potential suspects. Washburn voluntarily gave a sample of his DNA, and it was a match to the DNA found on Jennifer Bastian's murder scene. He was arrested and brought back to Pierce County, Washington to stand trial. Washburn first came on the Tacoma police radar when he called in to give a tip on Michelle's murder. Friends and family that knew him as an older man found it hard to fathom Washburn as a child killer. They knew him as a doting father and full-time caretaker for his disabled daughter. Even Washburn's ex-wife had no idea. "I would have divorced him and turned him in. I am happy for that family, for that little girl. We never saw this coming. He was always gentle." Robert Washburn pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Jennifer Bastian and was sentenced to 26 years in prison. In the case of finding Michelle's killer, police caught an extremely lucky break using genetic genealogy. Typically, DNA evidence was only relevant if there was a suspect to compare it to. Databases like the FBI's CODIS only had DNA of prior criminals, but if investigators were looking for someone who had never been convicted of a crime in the past, they were out of luck. Using the DNA from Michelle's crime scene, police entered the DNA into a public online DNA matching website, gedmatch.com. After uploading the DNA, they were able to create a family tree. The family tree limited suspects down to two brothers that lived in North Tacoma in 1986 near Puget Park, where Michelle was killed. Police followed 66-year-old Gary Charles Hartman from his job as a nurse at Western State Hospital to a restaurant in Tacoma, where he had lunch with a coworker. Detectives sat at a table in the restaurant and had lunch just 10 feet away. They watched as Hartman finished his lunch, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and placed the napkin in a paper bag. Hartman then left the bag on the table and left the restaurant. Detectives then gathered the napkin, which contained his DNA, and submitted it to the police lab for testing. The DNA was indeed a match to the DNA left at the scene of Michelle's murder, which led police to arrest Hartman. Like Washburn, Hartman led an otherwise completely normal life, and news of his arrest for such a heinous crime shocked his friends and family. Hartman was a father of two who collected vintage cars. He was working as a community nurse specialist at Western State Hospital and had no criminal record. Acquaintances described him as a pleasant, even-tempered guy. Hartman had lived within a mile of Puget Park at the time of Michelle's murder. Gary Hartman has not pleaded guilty and is still awaiting trial. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.